My name is Adrian Marsh. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my career, I've worked in places where being calm, competent, and reliable mattered more than being visible. I've never been the loudest voice in the room. I don't dominate meetings. I don't sell myself with exaggeration. I listen carefully, take notes that most people forget, and do my work quietly, often long after others have stopped paying attention. People tend to underestimate people like that. If you ask my coworkers how they saw me back then, they might have said I was steady, easygoing, and low drama. Someone once described me as the kind of guy you don't have to worry about. At the time, I took that as a compliment. Only later did I understand what it also meant. I was invisible enough to be convenient, dependable enough to absorb blame, quiet enough not to interrupt someone else's story. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about outplaying anyone or exposing a villain. There's no shouting, no dramatic showdown, no moment where everyone claps because the truth finally comes out. What happened to me unfolded slowly, almost politely. It began with assumptions, it deepened through silence, and it reached a turning point on a day when I was blamed, publicly, for something I had nothing to do with. The presentation failed. The room was tense. Leadership wanted answers, and my boss said my name. The problem was simple. I wasn't even on the project. I hadn't contributed to the slides. I hadn't reviewed the data. I hadn't attended the planning meetings. Yet in that moment, with eyes turning toward me, I said nothing. Not because I agreed, not because I was afraid, but because, up until then, silence had always seemed like the responsible choice, the professional one, the mature one. What I didn't realize was that silence, when misunderstood, doesn't protect you. It reshapes you. It allows other people to define your role for you, often in ways that serve them, not you. This story is about how that moment didn't explode my life, but quietly reorganized it. How being blamed for something small revealed something much larger about power, perception, and the cost of letting narratives form without your consent. I'll take you through how I was seen, how I stayed quiet for reasons that made sense at the time, and how I eventually recognized that my restraint was being interpreted as permission. There's no hero arc here. No sudden courage, no dramatic triumph, just observation, documentation, patience, and a decision made without anger, but with clarity. I'm telling this story honestly, not to stir outrage and not to paint myself as flawless, but because I know how easy it is to disappear in plain sight, and how dangerous it can be when your silence becomes the most convenient explanation in the room. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever stayed quiet, believing it would keep the peace, only to realize later that it quietly put the blame on you instead? To most people at work, I was useful in the way furniture is useful. Present, reliable, taken for granted. I wasn't invisible in the literal sense. People knew my name, they knew where I sat, they knew I'd respond to emails quickly and fix problems without escalating them. But I existed on the periphery of attention, outside the circle where reputations are actively shaped and defended. In meetings, I spoke when asked, rarely before. I chose my words carefully, trimmed away anything that sounded emotional or self-promotional. When discussions became heated, I stayed neutral. When others interrupted, I let them. When credit was handed out unevenly, I told myself the work mattered more than recognition. And for a long time, that belief felt like maturity. My boss trusted me, but not in the way people imagine trust. He trusted that I wouldn't challenge him publicly, trusted that I'd absorb ambiguity without complaint. Trusted that if something needed to be fixed quietly, I'd handle it without drawing attention to how broken it had been in the first place. I was the person projects drifted toward when no one else wanted to deal with the mess. Colleagues came to me for help, not advocacy. For answers, not alignment. I'd stay late walking someone through a spreadsheet, then watch them present the solution the next morning as if it had materialized overnight. I didn't resent them. I told myself this was just how teams worked. What I didn't notice was how consistently my name was missing from the story afterward. When managers talked about key contributors, they named the loud ones. When problems were discussed in hindsight, my involvement was described vaguely. Operations helped. Analysis supported. No one was lying. They just weren't being precise. And precision, I was learning, only exists when someone insists on it. The truth is, I made myself easy to overlook. I thought humility would protect me. I thought restraint would earn respect. I thought that if I stayed calm and competent long enough, the right people would eventually notice. But organizations don't reward silence. They use it. Over time, a role settled around me without anyone explicitly assigning it. I was the steady one, the fallback, the person whose presence reassured others without threatening them. If something went right, it belonged to the team. If something went wrong, it belonged to whoever hadn't clearly claimed their part. And I rarely claimed mine. There was a subtle shift in how people spoke around me. Conversations about decisions I'd influenced happened as if I'd merely observed them. Assumptions were made about my availability, my agreement, and my responsibility without checking. I noticed. Of course I did. But I explained it away. They're busy. It's not personal. This isn't the hill to die on. Each rationalization felt reasonable on its own. Together, they built a version of me that existed mostly in other people's convenience. Looking back, I understand this clearly. I wasn't underestimated because I lacked ability. I was underestimated because I never disrupted the story others told about me. And when the story needs a quiet place to land, someone safe to absorb discomfort without pushing back, it looks for someone exactly like who I had allowed myself to become. At the time, I still believed silence was neutral. I hadn't yet learned that silence is read, interpreted, used. And once a role like that settles in, it doesn't stay small for long. The first time it happened, it barely registered as an event. There was no tension in the room, no raised voices, no awkward pause that made people shift in their chairs. It happened the way most meaningful things do at work, quietly, efficiently, wrapped in politeness. We were in a weekly update meeting, 8 people around the table, laptops open, coffee cooling, the kind of meeting where everyone is half listening, waiting for their turn to speak. A project I'd been supporting had just wrapped up. Not leading, supporting. But I'd handled the operational modeling, caught 2 data inconsistencies, and flagged a timeline issue early enough to avoid a downstream delay. Nothing heroic, just competent work. When the project lead summarized the outcome, he spoke confidently. Clicking through slides I'd reviewed line by line, he talked about the team's effort, about the approach we decided on. Then my manager leaned forward slightly and said, "Yeah, this one was tricky. We had some execution issues early on." He paused. And then he added, "But Adrian helped clean it up." The wording was subtle, almost generous on the surface. Helped clean it up, not identified the issue, not prevented the problem, just assisted after the fact, like a mop, not a censor. I felt it, a small internal flinch. The kind you ignore because it feels petty to dwell on. No one else reacted. The conversation moved on. Someone cracked a joke. The moment passed. I said nothing. At my desk later that afternoon, I replayed it in my head. Not angrily, just analytically. I told myself it didn't matter. Titles and phrasing were fluid. Intentions were probably good. I wasn't leading the project anyway. Correcting the record would have felt excessive, so I let it go. A week later, the same phrasing showed up in an email. A summary sent to leadership. Thanks to everyone involved. Special appreciation to the core team. Adrian assisted with cleanup and follow-through. Again, no lie, just an incomplete truth. That's how the first cut works. It doesn't injure you enough to demand attention. It just introduces a new version of events, one where your contribution is reactive instead of proactive, supportive instead of structural, optional instead of essential. I noticed how quickly that version became the default. People began looping me in later rather than earlier. Questions shifted from, "What do you think?" to, "Can you take a look?" Subtle, but directional. I became the person you consulted after decisions had already been framed. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of it was pride. I didn't want to seem like someone who needed to be acknowledged to function. Part of it was conditioning. Years of being told that speaking up too much made things harder for everyone, and part of it was fear, not of conflict, but of being misunderstood, of being labeled sensitive, defensive, difficult. So I absorbed it. What surprised me wasn't the behavior itself. It was how invisible it was to everyone else. When I mentioned the project casually to a colleague from another team, they said, "Oh yeah, I heard that one was rough. Glad you were able to help fix it." Fix it. That word again. Like the problem had already existed before I touched it. I nodded, smiled, changed the subject. That night, I wrote the date in my notebook. Just the facts. Who said what? How it was phrased. No commentary, no emotion. I didn't know why I did it. It wasn't a strategy yet. It was just a way of preserving reality somewhere, in case I needed to remember how things had actually happened. At the time, I still believed this was an isolated thing. A miscommunication, a small cut that would heal on its own. What I didn't understand was that the cut wasn't the problem. The problem was that everyone else had accepted the new version of me without resistance, and I had quietly confirmed it by staying silent. Once the first small cut is accepted, everything that follows starts to feel familiar. Not dramatic, not offensive, just normal. That's how it worked for me. Nothing escalated in a way that would justify a complaint or a confrontation. There were no emails you could forward to HR and say, "This is clearly wrong." Instead, there was a slow recalibration of expectations, one I didn't consciously agree to but also didn't resist. I began to notice patterns. Meetings would be scheduled, then rescheduled, and my calendar would be the first one adjusted without anyone asking. Decisions would be made in side conversations I wasn't included in, even when the outcome landed squarely in my lap. When timelines slipped, the language shifted subtly. Operations underestimated the complexity, as if that assessment had been collective, even when it hadn't been discussed. Each instance on its own was defensible. Together they formed a narrative. I was the steady executor, not the thinker, the cleaner, not the architect. And I played along. When people spoke over me, I waited. When someone rephrased my idea and received credit for it, I told myself the idea mattered more than the source. When feedback was delivered indirectly, through tone, through implication, I translated it internally instead of asking for clarity. Silence became my default response, not because I lacked opinions, but because expressing them felt inefficient. Like it would slow things down, like it would introduce friction where none was necessary. That was the lie I kept telling myself. The truth was simpler. Staying quiet was easier than recalibrating how people saw me, easier than risking discomfort, easier than discovering that maybe the respect I thought I'd earned was conditional. My boss leaned into this dynamic without ever acknowledging it. He'd assign me tasks with phrases like, "I know you'll just handle this," or "You don't need much direction." Again, they sounded like compliments, and in isolation, they were. But what they really meant was, "You won't ask questions, you won't push back, you won't make this harder." I noticed that when something went well, the praise floated upward. When something stalled, the attention drifted sideways, toward me, not aggressively, just naturally, as if that's where responsibility lived now. I started preparing more than necessary, double-checking assumptions no one else questioned, saving drafts, archiving messages, not because I anticipated blame, but because something in me had started to feel unanchored, like the ground under my role was shifting, and I needed reference points. Still, I said nothing. Friends outside of work would ask how things were going. I'd say, "Fine, busy." And it was true. I was busy smoothing edges, filling gaps, and making sure things didn't fall apart in ways that would inconvenience others. What I didn't say was that I felt myself shrinking, not in confidence, but in visibility, like my presence was being edited down to function only. There's a particular kind of disrespect that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't insult you. It doesn't challenge you directly. It simply assumes you'll adapt, that you'll absorb the inconvenience, that you'll remain available, agreeable, and quiet. And once you do that a few times, people stop asking whether it's okay. They assume it is. I rationalized it in every way imaginable. This is temporary. They're under pressure. This is just corporate culture. I don't want to be that guy. Each rationalization brought me short-term comfort and long-term erosion. The most dangerous part wasn't that others were normalizing the disrespect. It was that I was. I began to preemptively lower my expectations, to speak less, not because I had less to say, but because I didn't expect it to land. I adjusted my posture in rooms, literally and figuratively, so I wouldn't take up too much space. And the more I did that, the more natural it felt to everyone else. By the time I realized something was wrong, it didn't feel like something had been taken from me. It felt like I had quietly handed it over. I don't remember the moment the role became official. There was no meeting, no announcement, no email outlining expectations. It just settled into place the way dust does, gradually, invisibly, until one day you notice everything is coated in the same fine layer. I was the reliable one. Not the kind of reliable that leads or decides, the kind that absorbs, the kind you lean on without asking how much weight it can carry. If something needed follow-through, I was there. If something was unclear, it became my responsibility to clarify. If a project was behind, my time was assumed to be flexible enough to compensate. People stopped checking before assigning me things. They framed tasks as inevitabilities rather than requests. Can you just take this? You're good at this kind of stuff. It shouldn't take you long. None of it was hostile. That was the problem. Hostility gives you something to push against. This was smoother than that. It was framed as trust, as an appreciation, as efficiency, and because I had built my identity around being competent and unproblematic, I accepted it. What I didn't realize was that I was also being written into other people's contingency plans. If something went wrong, it wouldn't be catastrophic. It would just quietly land on me. If a deadline was unrealistic, I was expected to stretch. If a decision had consequences, my involvement would be described in vague terms that suggested shared responsibility without shared authority. I noticed how often my name appeared in sentences that began with "we assumed." We assumed you were okay with this. We assumed you'd have time. We assumed you were looped in. Assumption replaced consent. In meetings, I was positioned as support even when my input had shaped the direction. When new hires were onboarded, they were told, "Adrian can help you figure things out." Not, "Adrian helped design this." Help, not build. Assist, not originate. That distinction matters more than people think, because when a role is defined as supportive, accountability flows downward. You become responsible without being empowered, present without being protected. I still didn't push back. Part of me believed this was just a phase, that once things stabilized, roles would rebalance. Another part of me feared that challenging the role would confirm something worse, that maybe this was all I was seen as capable of. So I stayed inside the lines. I worked harder, cleaner, quieter, and the more consistently I delivered, the more fixed the role became. Reliability, when unaccompanied by visibility, doesn't elevate you. It anchors you. My boss started speaking for me in rooms I wasn't in. "Adrian's got it. He's handling that." Decisions were justified with my presumed agreement. My silence, both literal and historical, was treated as endorsement. There was a strange moment of clarity one afternoon, sitting alone at my desk. I was updating a document that summarized risks I had flagged weeks earlier, risks that had been dismissed. Now they were urgent. Now they were real. As I typed, I realized something uncomfortable. If this failed, the narrative was already written. I would be the one who handled it, and if it succeeded, the credit would float upward as it always had. I wasn't being set up to fail. I was being set up to absorb. And that's when it hit me, not as anger, but as recognition. This was the role they expected me to play. Reliable, useful, invisible. Not because they were malicious, but because I had shown them, over and over again, that I would accept it. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voice, no email that made my stomach drop. It was an ordinary workday, broken up by routine tasks and small conversations that barely registered as moments at all. If you'd asked anyone else what happened that day, they probably wouldn't remember it. I remember it clearly. It started with a meeting I wasn't supposed to attend. A last-minute invite appeared on my calendar with no context, just a title and a time. I assumed it was another handoff, another request to help clean something up, so I joined, notebook in hand, ready to listen. Halfway through, I realized they were discussing a project that had already gone off course. Decisions had been made without me. Timelines committed, assumptions stacked on top of each other. And now, as the constraints became obvious, the conversation began to tilt toward resolution, toward who could step in to stabilize things. My name came up casually, not as a question, as a solution. "Adrian can probably help us realign this." Probably. I listened as they outlined the problem. I recognized it immediately. I had flagged the exact risk months earlier, in writing. It had been acknowledged, then quietly deprioritized. Now it was back, louder and more expensive. Still, I didn't interrupt. Instead, I felt something new, distance. Not disengagement, not resentment, just a widening gap between what I knew and what I was expected to accept. For the first time, I wasn't focused on fixing the problem. I was watching the structure around it, the way responsibility moved, the way language softened accountability, the way my presence was used to reassure everyone else. At one point, my boss summarized the situation and said, "We should have caught this earlier." I glanced around the room. People nodded. The moment passed. And in that quiet space, something clicked. I realized that if I spoke up now, if I reminded them of the earlier warning, if I corrected the record, it would sound defensive, disruptive, like I was trying to protect myself instead of the project. That realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. I understood, in a way I hadn't before, that timing matters more than truth in environments like this. Speaking up late, even when you're right, can cost you more than staying silent. So I stayed silent. But it wasn't the same silence as before. I wasn't swallowing anything. I wasn't rationalizing. I was observing, taking notes, watching how easily the narrative reshaped itself to preserve comfort. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and opened my notebook. I didn't write about how I felt. I wrote what happened, who said what, when decisions were made, what had been documented before. For the first time, I wasn't preparing to fix anything. I was preparing to understand. That afternoon, I declined a task I would normally have accepted without question, not aggressively, just neutrally. I said I was at capacity and asked how they wanted to prioritize. There was a pause on the other end of the call, a slight recalibration. "Let's talk about it later," my boss said. That pause mattered more than any confrontation could have. It told me something had shifted, not in them, but in how my behavior was being interpreted. For years, my availability had been assumed. Now it had been questioned. I didn't feel empowered. I didn't feel victorious. I felt awake. I went home that night and realized I wasn't replaying conversations the way I used to. I wasn't wondering what I should have said. I wasn't editing myself in hindsight. I had seen the pattern clearly enough that it no longer confused me. That day didn't change my situation. It changed my orientation. And once that happens, you don't rush. You don't confront. You don't announce. You wait. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive. A habit, a default setting I returned to because it felt safe and professional. Now it was deliberate, measured, chosen with awareness of how it would be interpreted and by whom. I still didn't speak much in meetings. I still didn't interrupt, but the reason was different. I wasn't holding myself back. I was letting things reveal themselves. When assumptions were made, I didn't rush to correct them. I watched to see who benefited. When timelines were agreed to without my input, I noted who volunteered my capacity on my behalf. When my name was used to signal reassurance, Adrian's across this, I paid attention to who said it and when. Silence, I realized, creates space, and people fill that space with their expectations. My colleagues mistook my continued quiet for compliance. My boss especially seemed relieved. He leaned into the familiar dynamic, delegating through implication rather than instruction. He spoke in conclusions instead of questions. My role, as far as he could tell, hadn't changed. What he didn't notice was that I had stopped absorbing ambiguity. When something was unclear, I asked for clarification in writing. When priorities conflicted, I requested explicit direction. When decisions were made without me, I followed up with neutral summaries that documented the outcome without endorsing the process. No emotion, no accusation, just records. I stopped fixing things preemptively, not out of spite, but out of alignment. If I hadn't consulted early, I wouldn't have rushed to clean up the consequences quietly. I let delays surface. I let friction become visible. It was uncomfortable at first. My instinct was still to smooth things over, to protect the system from its own inefficiencies. But each time I resisted that urge, something interesting happened. Other people started to feel the weight they had been handing off. Questions that used to land in my inbox as assumptions now arrive as requests. Some were withdrawn when it became clear they required effort or accountability. Others were escalated elsewhere. I was no longer the automatic solution. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still showed up, still delivered what I agreed to, still spoke calmly and respectfully. But internally, I had drawn a line between what I was responsible for and what I was merely convenient for. That line had never existed before. My boss noticed it, but misread it. He interpreted my distance as disengagement, not strategy. He filled the silence with his own narrative, that I was overwhelmed or less invested or simply coasting. He didn't ask. And I didn't correct him. Silence, when chosen, is a mirror. It reflects back whatever story someone already believes. In one meeting, a senior leader asked a question directly related to a risk I had documented months earlier. The room went quiet. I could have answered. I could have connected the dots. Instead, my boss jumped in. He spoke confidently and inaccurately. No one challenged him. The conversation moved on. I wrote the date down, not because I planned to expose him, but because I understood something fundamental. Truth without timing is just noise. And timing, in organizations like this, belongs to those who understand the structure. I wasn't powerless. I was positioned. And the position doesn't require announcement. It requires patience. I didn't need to prove anything yet. The system was already doing that for me. By leaning on my silence, others were revealing their dependencies. By assuming my compliance, they were documenting their own assumptions. The more I said nothing, the clearer the pattern became. Silence hadn't made me invisible. It had made me indispensable in ways no one had bothered to define. And when something is undefined, it's vulnerable. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting and started preparing. From the outside, my behavior hadn't changed enough to trigger concern. I still met deadlines. I still answered messages. I still showed up calm and composed, the way I always had. If anything, I seemed easier to manage, less resistant, less visible. That's what made the preparation possible. I began documenting everything, not obsessively, not emotionally, but methodically. Decisions, timelines, ownership. I saved meeting notes. I archived versions of files. I kept emails exactly as they were, even when a quick clarification might have cleaned things up. I wanted the record to reflect reality, not intention. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about preserving the truth in a system that preferred convenience over accuracy. I paid attention to language. Who said we when they meant you? Who said assisted instead of led? Who summarized outcomes without mentioning the warnings that had preceded them? Language reveals responsibility long before outcomes do. I also started learning things no one thought to hide from me. Because I was seen as non-threatening, people spoke freely around me. They vented, they speculated, they explained decisions in ways they wouldn't have if they thought I was positioning myself. I listened without reacting, without correcting, without signaling that I was storing any of it. The notebook filled up slowly. I mapped dependencies, not on paper, but in my head. Who relied on whose approval? Which teams were understaffed, where knowledge was centralized in a single person? I noticed how often my name came up when something stalled, even if I wasn't involved. I began to understand the organization as a system, not a hierarchy. And in that system, I occupied an unusual position. I wasn't powerful. I didn't control budgets or titles, but I sat at the intersection of processes that no one fully understood end to end. I knew how information moved, or didn't. I knew which shortcuts were taken and which safeguards were assumed to exist because someone like me had always quietly provided them. No one had ever asked me to do this. I had just always done it. So I stopped filling the gaps automatically, not abruptly, gradually. I let my availability reflect my actual scope. When people asked questions outside that scope, I redirected them. When assumptions were made about my involvement, I clarified neutrally. I'm not currently supporting that, and waited. I noticed how quickly confusion followed. There were meetings where decisions stalled because no one had the full picture. Emails where urgency spiked because something I used to catch early had slipped through. None of it was catastrophic, but it was noticeable. Still, no one connected it to me. They assumed the system was under strain. Those things were unusually busy, that someone else had dropped the ball. I kept my head down and continued learning. I reviewed past project retrospectives and noticed patterns, how responsibility was described after the fact. I compared those narratives to the actual sequence of events. The gap between them was instructive. I realized that accountability in this environment flowed toward whoever didn't resist it. And for years, that had been me. What they never noticed was that I was no longer available for that role. Not emotionally, not structurally. I had stopped being the silent buffer between poor decisions and their consequences. I wasn't exposing anything. I wasn't sabotaging. I was simply allowing reality to surface without interference. And reality, it turns out, has a way of changing conversations. There was a moment, small, easily missed, when I knew preparation was complete. A senior leader asked for a status update on an initiative I had quietly stepped away from weeks earlier. The room turned to me out of habit. I met their gaze and said calmly, "I'm not involved in that." No explanation, no apology, just a fact. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was disoriented. People glanced at each other, recalibrating assumptions they hadn't realized they were making. I didn't fill the gap. I let them sit with it. Because by then, I understood something they didn't yet see. I wasn't stepping into power. I was stepping out of the role that made their power comfortable. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no sense of triumph, no moment where everything suddenly made sense all at once. It arrived quietly, the way clarity often does, when enough pieces have already been laid out and your mind finally stops resisting the picture they form. I was reviewing a project archive late one evening, not because anyone asked me to, not because something was on fire. I was tracing a thread backward, following decisions from outcome to origin, step by step, just to understand how we kept ending up in the same place. That's when I saw it. A pattern so consistent it was almost elegant. Major initiatives passed through the same informal checkpoints, the same assumptions, the same compressed timelines were approved without verification, and when those initiatives faltered, responsibility diffused downward. Not to the people who shaped the constraints, but to the ones who quietly kept things running afterward. People like me. What made it different this time was documentation. Emails acknowledging risks, meeting notes where concerns were raised and deprioritized, versions of files that showed when decisions shifted and who initiated those shifts. Individually, none of it was explosive. Together, it was undeniable. I realized that I had been functioning as a kind of structural insurance policy, not officially, not intentionally, but practically. My presence allowed others to move faster, take shortcuts, and defer consequences because they assumed someone steady would absorb the impact later. And for years, that assumption had been correct, until it wasn't. The private reveal wasn't about discovering leverage over a person. It was about understanding leverage over a system. I saw clearly how much institutional knowledge I carried, not just facts, but context. Not just processes, but the reasons they existed. I understood where fragility had been disguised as efficiency, where silence had been mistaken for agreement, and I understood something else too. None of this had been malicious. That mattered, because it meant I didn't need to expose anyone. I didn't need to confront or accuse. The system wasn't broken because of villains. It was broken because it relied on unspoken labor and punished the people who provided it. The moment of clarity came when I asked myself a simple question. What would happen if I stopped protecting the story? Not the work, not the people, the story. The story that said things just worked. Those issues were unforeseeable. That responsibility was shared even when authority wasn't. I wasn't angry when I saw it. I felt oddly calm, almost relieved, because confusion had been replaced by understanding. I wasn't being singled out. I was being used as ballast. Once I understood that, everything changed internally. I stopped wondering how to fix my reputation. I stopped thinking in terms of recognition. Those were surface concerns. What mattered was alignment between what I did, what I was accountable for, and what I allowed others to assume. I reviewed my notes one more time, checked dates, cross-referenced conversations. Everything I needed already existed. I hadn't created leverage. I had simply noticed it. And because I had done so quietly, without signaling intent, no one else knew what I now understood. That asymmetry was the leverage, not to exploit, but to choose. I didn't rush into action. I didn't change my behavior overnight. I just stopped feeling uncertain, stopped doubting my interpretation, stopped second-guessing whether I was imagining patterns that weren't there. They were there. They had always been there. The reveal didn't empower me in the way people usually imagine empowerment. It didn't make me louder. It didn't make me bolder. It made me precise. And precision is dangerous, not because it harms others, but because it removes plausible deniability. From that moment on, every choice mattered, and I knew the next one would be irreversible. Once you see the structure clearly, you can't unsee it. That was the weight of the decision in front of me. Not whether to act, but how. Because every option carried consequences, and none of them would return me to the comfortable ambiguity I'd been living in before. I took my time. I laid out the paths in my head, one by one, and followed them to their logical ends. I could confront my boss directly, Sit down, walk him through the documentation, explain how the narrative had shifted, how responsibility had been misplaced. It would be clean, professional, and likely ineffective. Best case, he'd apologize and adjust slightly. Worst case, he'd feel exposed and defensive. Either way, the system that enabled it would remain intact, and I'd be marked as someone who made things uncomfortable. I could escalate, bring everything to leadership or HR. That path looked righteous on paper. But escalation in organizations like this doesn't resolve patterns. It freezes them. It creates files, not changes. I'd become a problem to be managed, not a reality to be addressed. I could also do nothing. Continue absorbing, continue documenting, continue letting my role erode until the next public misattribution lands harder than the last. That path required the least effort in the short term and the most self-betrayal in the long run. None of those options aligned with what I now understood. There was a fourth path, quieter, slower, and irreversible. I could realign my responsibility with my authority without announcement, without accusation, and without asking for permission. That meant making my boundaries structural, not emotional. It meant choosing what I would no longer do, rather than demanding others change how they treated me. It also meant accepting that once I did this, the story others told about me would shift, and I wouldn't be able to control how. That was the risk. I asked myself one final question, the one that made the decision clear. If nothing changes, what does this cost me? The answer wasn't stress or frustration. I could handle those. The cost was integrity. The slow erosion of alignment between my work and my values. The quiet resentment that grows when you keep the peace at your own expense. I decided I wouldn't correct the past. I would redesign the future. The choice I made wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen in a single conversation or a bold declaration. It was a series of small, deliberate shifts that, together, closed the gap between assumption and reality. I formalized my scope, updated documentation to reflect actual ownership, declined tasks that didn't align with my role, and documented those decisions neutrally. I stopped being the default reviewer for projects I wasn't leading. I stopped attending meetings where my presence was symbolic rather than functional. I didn't explain myself. Explanation invites negotiation. I wasn't negotiating. The first time I said, "That's not something I'm responsible for," out loud, it felt strange. Not empowering, just accurate. The words didn't carry heat, they carried clarity. Some people adjusted, others didn't. That was information. I knew this path would surface consequences, that people would feel the absence of the quiet support they'd grown used to. Those questions would be asked, not about process, but about me. I accepted that, because this choice wasn't about being liked. It wasn't even about being respected in the abstract. It was about refusing to continue a role that depended on my silence to function. Once that decision was made, there was no going back. Not because I had burned bridges, but because I had stopped standing on one that only existed for other people's convenience. Once the decision was made, I didn't announce it. I didn't gather anyone into a room. I didn't send an email outlining new boundaries or asking for alignment. I simply started moving differently, quietly, consistently, and without commentary. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. I still showed up on time, still responded to messages, still delivered what I agreed to deliver. The difference was in what I no longer agreed to by default. When a project I wasn't assigned to began to wobble, I didn't step in preemptively. I waited for a formal request. When one came, I asked clarifying questions before accepting: scope, timeline, ownership. If those answers were vague, I declined or deferred. Politely, neutrally, in writing. I stopped being the buffer. I let emails sit when they were framed as assumptions rather than requests. I forwarded decisions back to their owners when consequences emerged. I summarized meetings accurately instead of smoothing over contradictions. If something was unresolved, it stayed unresolved. None of this was aggressive, but it was visible. At first, people assumed I was just busy. Then they assumed I was disengaged. Then, quietly, they started adjusting their behavior. Some looped me in earlier. Others stopped looping me in at all. Both outcomes were acceptable. My boss noticed the shift, but not its cause. He grew more directive, then more distant. He began checking in less, then more abruptly. His confidence in the system wavered, not because of me directly, but because the quiet safety net he relied on was no longer absorbing the shock. Still, he said nothing, and neither did I. I took care to remain professional. I didn't vent, I didn't hint, I didn't signal dissatisfaction. Emotional neutrality was part of the strategy. Without emotion, there was nothing to argue with. Behind the scenes, I continued to align everything I did with documented responsibility. I made sure my contributions were traceable, time-stamped, and clearly scoped. Not to protect myself from accusation, but to make ownership visible where it had previously been blurred. What surprised me most was how long it took for anyone to connect the dots. Systems don't notice quiet changes immediately. They only notice outcomes. A deadline slipped that I would have quietly rescued before. A presentation lacked context, which I would have provided unprompted. A decision stalled because no one had the full picture, and no one had thought to ask me. None of these were disasters, but they created friction. And friction invites scrutiny. People started asking different questions. Not can Adrian handle this, but who owns this? That shift was subtle, but profound. Ownership, once questioned, doesn't return easily to ambiguity. I watched as responsibilities were clarified, sometimes awkwardly. As meetings became more explicit, as tasks were reassigned with more care. I didn't insert myself into these changes. I let them happen. There's a misconception that power is loud, that it announces itself, that it demands recognition. In reality, the most effective shifts happen without spectacle. They occur when the structure is forced to adapt to reality instead of relying on invisible labor to compensate. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was removing myself from a role that had never been formally acknowledged. And as I moved in silence, the consequences began to surface, not as blame, but as absence. The system felt different, unfamiliar, and for the first time, that discomfort wasn't mine to manage. The consequences didn't arrive with drama. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. A missed detail here, a delayed response there, small inefficiencies that no one could quite explain. People assumed it was a temporary lull, a busy season, a run of bad timing. But the pattern didn't resolve. Meetings started running longer without producing clarity. Follow-ups multiplied. Questions circled back unanswered. Work that used to flow quietly from one stage to the next began to stall at the seams, and no one could point to a single failure. That's the thing about invisible labor. When it disappears, people don't notice who was doing it. They just notice that things feel harder. I watched this unfold without commentary. Not because I enjoyed it, but because intervening would have restored the very dynamic I was trying to exit. Stepping in now would have reinforced the idea that I was still the safety net, still responsible for stabilizing things I didn't own. So I stayed within my scope. When asked directly for help, I responded clearly. When something fell outside my role, I said so calmly, no justification, no defensiveness. The first real sign of consequence came during a leadership review. I wasn't in the room, but I heard about it afterward. A project status was challenged, assumptions were questioned. Someone asked why a known risk hadn't been addressed earlier. There was a pause. Then someone said, "I thought Adrian was covering that." That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have, because for the first time, it didn't land. Someone else asked, "Was he assigned to it?" No one answered immediately. The confusion wasn't about me, it was about ownership. And ownership, once examined, exposes habits people didn't realize they had. I noticed a shift in tone after that. Fewer assumptions, more clarifying questions. Emails that once ended with, "Thanks, Adrian," now ended with, "Let me know who should take this." Not all of it was graceful. Some people grew frustrated, others defensive. A few quietly resented the extra effort now required to coordinate things that used to just work. But none of that was directed at me explicitly, because there was nothing to accuse. I hadn't refused work. I hadn't failed to deliver. I had simply stopped compensating for decisions I didn't make. My boss felt it most. He began asking more questions in meetings, double-checking timelines, looping in people he'd previously assumed were aligned. His confidence softened, not into humility, but into caution. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk. "Things feel a bit off lately," he said, trying to sound casual. I nodded. "There's been a lot of moving parts." He hesitated. "You seem less involved." I looked at him and said, "I've been focusing on what I'm responsible for." There was no accusation in my voice, just a statement. He didn't respond right away. That silence was different from the ones I'd lived in before. This time, it wasn't protective. It was searching. After that, I noticed my name being used differently, less as a placeholder for reassurance, more as a point of reference. Should we check with Adrian instead of Adrian's got it? The system was adjusting, not because I forced it to, but because it had lost the quiet support it had depended on without acknowledging it. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, but as exposure. And exposure doesn't need noise. It just needs absence. By the time people realized something needed fixing, they were already too late. Not because the situation was irreversible in a dramatic sense, but because the version of me they had relied on no longer existed, and they didn't know when it had disappeared. The first signs of panic weren't loud. They came disguised as urgency. Emails marked high priority, meetings scheduled with less notice, requests framed as collaboration but carrying the weight of expectation. The system was trying to recreate a pattern it no longer fully understood. What it didn't grasp was that nothing had broken suddenly. Something had simply stopped compensating. My boss became more involved again. He reviewed details he'd previously waved through. He asked questions that revealed how much he'd relied on my quiet presence to smooth over uncertainty. There was a subtle edge to his tone now, not anger, but pressure, as if effort alone could restore the old equilibrium. One afternoon, he asked me to join a call with senior leadership. A project had gone off track, and there were questions about why earlier signals hadn't been acted on. I joined, listened, and answered only what was asked, nothing more. At one point, someone said, "Could this have been caught sooner?" The room went still. I could have spoken, I could have explained, I could have pointed to emails, notes, timestamps, everything I needed existed. But I didn't. Not because I wanted anyone to fail, because fixing it now would have meant rewriting the story again, taking responsibility for a system that had already decided how it worked. Instead, I said calmly, the risk was identified earlier, but the timeline was already set. That was all. No names, no defense, no expansion. The conversation moved on, uncomfortable but contained. After the call, my boss lingered. "We need to get back to how things were," he said. Not unkindly, just tired. I looked at him and realized he wasn't asking me to help with the project. He was asking me to resume a role, and that role was no longer available. "I'm focused on my current scope," I said. "If you want to redefine it, we should do that explicitly." That was the moment I knew it couldn't be fixed quietly anymore, because what he wanted was restoration without acknowledgement, stability without accountability, the return of a version of me that made the system comfortable. But comfort had always been the problem. People began to scramble, not maliciously, not incompetently, but reactively. Tasks were reassigned, processes rewritten. Meetings multiplied. The organization was doing, in weeks, what it should have done gradually over the years. And it was exhausting. I felt none of the satisfaction people imagine comes with this kind of shift. No vindication, no sense of victory. Just a quiet certainty that the moment for easy repair had passed. Too much had been revealed. The assumptions were visible now. The gaps are undeniable. The reliance on unspoken labor is exposed. You can't unsee that. Some colleagues tried to reconnect with me the old way. Casual check-ins, indirect asks, familiar tones. I responded politely, but differently. I asked for clarity, for ownership, for boundaries. A few adapted quickly, others didn't. That divergence told me everything I needed to know. By the time leadership began discussing structural changes and process improvements, the narrative had already shifted. Not in my favor or against me, but away from the illusion that things had ever been as simple as they pretended. It was too late to fix it the easy way. The only way forward now was honest. And honesty, once required, changes everything. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic unveiling of evidence. Just a closed door, 2 chairs, and the weight of everything that had gone unsaid sitting between us. My boss asked for the meeting. Not urgently, not defensively, just a calendar invite titled Alignment. That word alone told me where things stood. When I walked in, he looked tired. Not guilty, not angry, just worn down by a system that had stopped cooperating with the assumptions it was built on. He started carefully. "I think there's been a breakdown," he said, "in expectations, in communication." I nodded. "I agree." That surprised him. He went on. He talked about pressure from above, about how fast things had been moving, about how much he'd relied on people he trusted to keep things running. "People like me? I didn't realize how much you were carrying," he said. "And I think that put you in some unfair situations." He waited for a reaction. I didn't give him one. Not because I was withholding, but because I wasn't there to release tension. I was there to be precise. I was carrying things I wasn't responsible for, I said, calmly. And because it wasn't explicit, it became invisible. There was no edge in my voice, no resentment, just a fact. He tried to respond, to explain, but I continued, not interrupting, just speaking when the space allowed. When the presentation failed, I said, and my name was mentioned publicly, that wasn't about blame. It was about an assumption that I was involved, that I had oversight, that I was accountable. I paused. I wasn't. That landed differently than anger ever could have. He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He just sat with it. For the first time, there was no version of events to smooth over, no silence to lean on, no quiet buffer absorbing discomfort. I wasn't asking for an apology. I wasn't demanding recognition. I was naming reality. I'm not interested in revisiting the past, I said, but going forward, my role needs to match my responsibility, or I need to step away from the things that don't. That was it. No ultimatum, no threat, just alignment. He nodded slowly. I should have been clearer, he said, and I should have asked. Yes, he should have. But what mattered wasn't the admission. It was what came next. He asked what I wanted. That question would have meant everything to me months earlier. Now it just felt late. I want clarity, I said, defined ownership, and no assumptions made in my name. He agreed, immediately, almost too quickly. That too was information. Because clarity offered after pressure isn't generosity, it's correction. We ended the meeting professionally, cordially. There was no tension left unresolved, because there had never been heat to begin with. As I left the room, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, closure. The confrontation hadn't changed him. It had changed the story. And that was enough. I didn't walk out of that meeting feeling transformed. There was no surge of confidence, no sense of triumph, no internal monologue about finally being seen. What I felt instead was something quieter and far more stable. Alignment. For the first time in a long while, the way I worked matched the way I understood myself. In the weeks that followed, things didn't magically improve. Processes were still messy. People still defaulted to old habits now and then, but the difference was this. When assumptions crept in, they were corrected, not by me insisting, but by the structure itself. Ownership was clearer. Meetings had agendas that meant something. Decisions were documented. When my name came up, it was attached to things I had actually agreed to carry. I spoke no more than I had before, but when I did, it landed. Not because I had become louder, but because I had stopped filling space unnecessarily. My words weren't competing with silence anymore. They were emerging from it. I noticed how people interacted with me differently. Not warmer, not colder, more intentional. They asked instead of assuming. They clarified instead of leaning. Some of that came from respect, some caution. Both were acceptable. What mattered was that I no longer felt erased by my own restraint. Outside of work, something shifted too. I stopped replaying conversations, stopped wondering whether I should have spoken up. That mental noise, the constant self-editing, faded. I realized how much energy I had spent protecting other people's comfort, and how little anyone had asked me to do it explicitly. Who I am now isn't someone hardened by experience. I'm still calm, still reflective, still slow to speak. But my silence has edges now. Boundaries. It's no longer a vacuum others can project onto. I don't rush to fix what isn't mine. I don't absorb discomfort to preserve appearances. I don't assume responsibility without authority. And I don't confuse being agreeable with being aligned. There's a difference between being underestimated and being undefined. I had lived in the second space for too long. Now, when someone asks what I do, I answer plainly. When someone tries to assign me something informally, I ask for context. When someone speaks for me, I correct it. Not emotionally, just factually. It turns out you don't need to be confrontational to be firm. You just need to stop disappearing. I didn't lose relationships through this process. I refined them. The people who respected clarity adapted quickly. The ones who relied on ambiguity drifted away. That too was alignment. I don't think of what happened as a victory or a loss. It was a recalibration, a return to something honest. Silence didn't fail me. Unexamined silence did. And now, when I choose not to speak, it's not because I'm afraid of disrupting the room. It's because I know exactly what my presence means. Looking back, I don't think the hardest part was being blamed. I realized how easily it happened. Not because anyone was cruel or careless, but because silence, when repeated long enough, starts to look like consent. And once that assumption settles in, it doesn't require proof. It just requires continuity. For a long time, I believed staying quiet was a form of integrity. That if I focused on doing good work and avoided conflict, things would balance out on their own. In some environments, maybe they do. In others, silence becomes a role you're assigned without ever agreeing to it. What this experience taught me is that power doesn't always come from speaking louder or asserting dominance. Sometimes it comes from understanding where your presence is being used to stabilize systems that don't acknowledge you. From recognizing when your effort is filling gaps that should be addressed structurally, not personally. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I didn't win by humiliating someone who made a mistake. I didn't even win by being publicly vindicated. I won by withdrawing consent. By choosing not to carry responsibilities I wasn't given authority over. By letting reality speak for itself instead of smoothing it over. By allowing discomfort to exist where it belonged instead of absorbing it silently. And that choice changed everything. If there's one thing I hope this story leaves you with, it's this. Silence is not neutral. It's interpreted, it's remembered, and eventually it's used. That doesn't mean you should speak at every injustice or correct every misunderstanding. It means you should be conscious of the patterns your silence creates and who benefits from them. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do isn't to argue or explain. It's to stop making yourself convenient. I don't tell this story to encourage confrontation. I tell it to encourage clarity, to remind you that being calm doesn't mean being passive, and being professional doesn't mean being invisible. If you've ever felt yourself slowly written out of your own work, if you've ever watched responsibility drift towards you without recognition, or stayed quiet to keep the peace only to find yourself blamed later, you're not alone. And you're not imagining it. The moment you begin to align your silence with intention, things change. Not always comfortably, not always quickly, but honestly. Before we end, I want to leave you with a question. One that doesn't have a right answer, only an honest one. Have you ever stayed silent to protect a situation, only to realize later that it was costing you more than it was saving? If so, I'd like to hear your story in the comments. Because silence is only lonely when we don't talk about what it's been carrying.